Greetings, this is the Question GM, and this is RPG A Day 2020 for day 21. And the word of the day is push. If there's really one thing I can really talk about push, or there's really something that that's interesting to talk about push, is probably this new idea or paradigm or mechanic, which is basically the push mechanic. As someone who is been playing D20 based games for quite a long time, the idea of a push mechanic is basically having an extra resource that the PCs can spend to trying to change the outcome of a check, which in most cases would be a D20 roll or a skill check and ability check. But rather than just roll and pray and then hoping that your modifiers will be able to suffice to get over the target number, some of these newer RPGs have this push mechanic which allows the players to do something extra to change the result, either for better or for worse, but usually for the better. And this will actually cause some kind of strain on the character as a result of doing that kind of push. Some good examples of games that uses this kind of push mechanic, I believe, would be Zero Engine, I believe, from Multiples Entertainment. And then I think there are also some modern role-playing games that typically either lets you change the results of your check either by taking damage or spending certain kind of resources, and that amount of resources can be very valuable or very difficult to regain back. In general, I think the idea for push mechanics is to put a stake into checks, increasing the high risk high reward factor to it. But I think there has to be a certain understanding of how GM could use a push mechanic to always make sure that the players who are using these mechanics are aware that whatever the risk they're taking is worth it. And I think it's kind of unfair if PCs actually are pushing for a check only to get a result that they either didn't expect, they didn't intend, or the price they had to pay for that check. As a GM, you have to really tell the PCs that what is at stake with the check they are about to do, and then which gives them the idea of how far they should push themselves to succeed on that check or to fail on that check. Generally, a fundamental thing about checks in general that and this is something maybe a lot of role-playing games don't communicate, or at least maybe intentionally so. But I think for myself, especially when there's a push mechanic involved, I would say in general, I would always try to tell my players what is at stake with the check, and what is the possible failures that can happen, what is the possible successful outcomes that could happen based on those checks. Naturally, this clashes with certain ideologies. If, for example, if you have players who wants to make checks for everything, and they insist on making a check, and they insist on having their successes honored based on the results of their check, not necessarily on the situation. And I think this is partly caused by how certain rules are written. D&D may lend to that kind of mentality a little bit more than other rules who states otherwise, even though if you actually read all the related rules of ability checks in D&D 5e, you actually find that was not how it was written to be played. But it's sort of the things that gets passed down through tradition or through customary practice of play. It's quite difficult to curb at times, where you as a GM have to decide that are you going to subscribe to that sort of method of play, or you're going to have to sit the player down and say, this is what the rule says and this is how we are doing it. But D&D doesn't have a push mechanic per se. They definitely have their own ways of modifying outcomes, but not necessarily at the cost of the characters who are performing the check. In general, I actually do like push mechanics, except that I think sometimes, like I said, if it can lead to certain dissatisfying results if the players are pushing for something to get something that they didn't want. And I also don't really like how certain push mechanics describe themselves as an after effect. Like, you have wrote the result, this is your potential result, and before you decide whether this check is legal, it becomes part of the fiction, you get to decide whether you want to push for it. I much prefer a system that sort of requires the players to make that decision first, after knowing what is at stake, and then spending the appropriate resources to push for that intended result that they want. And also I think push mechanics are also a little bit wonky depending on what kind of system it's used. Like, if it's what kind of rolling system it's based in, I think it's not all that helpful if it's in a dice pool based system, because when you push something and you spend resources to reroll certain dices, you are just as likely to get back the same results that you rolled previously. So I actually much prefer push mechanics to be used on the single die roll, and whether the push mechanics allows for a reroll or a additional modifier with some cost, that for me would really depend on the system of how it looks at the ability checks and how it should affect the game. Like if it's D&D, it's because ability checks can be very swingy. So I think it's much better to have either an additional dice introduced, like an advantage, or a fixed modifier compared to allowing a reroll of the dice. It's most likely we will see a lot of newer iterations of older games implement some kind of push mechanic in the future, and this is something definitely I think is getting more and more common in newer games nowadays. You will see a push mechanic of some kind. I guess it's going to take, you know, many more years for this idea to really play itself out and really see how interesting a push mechanic is. Maybe it comes to a point where a push mechanic becomes just a second chance at a test, and that just extends the procedure of making checks, and that may not turn out to be a good thing after a long time of practice. So I guess that's all I have to say for push, which is, you know, talking about push mechanics in general. And I think I'll be seeing you all on day 22 for RPG A Day 2020.